You ever look at your Ford? So you got a 289, 302, and when I say 302, I mean one of these 302s and not one of these 302s. And you just think to yourself, you know, man, this thing just ain't cutting it. It is just too slow. Well, fortunately, Ford already had a solution from the factory. You know, this is a common issue with Ford owners, being slow. But they already made a stroked, tall deck small block that will bolt right in to whatever situation you got, and it would make more power immediately. And they called it the 351 Windsor, which is precisely what I did with my 73 Mustang, as you can see in the background here. And I'm going to go around and basically show you guys how I did this full swap, because honestly I think it's a pretty straightforward swap, and there's not a whole lot of things you need to change to make more power instantly. Alrighty then, so getting right into it here, the donor motor was out of a 91 F-150, which, being an early 90s motor, makes this a non-roller motor, which honestly, this was totally fine given my goals. We're trying to keep the budget a little bit low here, so I got a known, well-running motor, paid $600 for it. It's from a truck that got wrecked, so I knew the motor was probably fine. It also had an automatic behind it, so I know the truck really was, you know, couldn't have been beat on too bad. It was completely stock, you can tell just by looking at it, but that being said, this is obviously an EFI motor. You can tell by the manifold on top of the fuel rails. And even though I do love the idea of keeping the EFI, I do think it's pretty much better in every single way. It can be a bit harder to tune. You need to buy extra components, the computers. If you can't tune, you got to pay someone else to tune it. So in the sense of the budget here, we ended up just going carbureted. You'll see at the end. But we ditched the EFI for right now. But getting right into the build, we do need to take the old motor out. It is kind of in the way. And so that's where we start our journey here. First things first, gotta get the exhaust and headers off. My exhaust system is not factory, pretty obvious, but that shouldn't really matter for the most part. When I was 16, first thing I did was take a sawzall to the exhaust and I straight piped my 302, which I will admit to 16-year-old me sounded pretty good for probably about a week, and then it got pretty old and obnoxious. So a good friend of mine welded up this exhaust for me, and I've been using it ever since. It's an axle dump, dual flow masters, has true duals as well, so it echoes off the ground pretty darn well. But it isn't to a point where it's obnoxious, so I think it works out pretty well for me. As for the headers, the passenger side is of course always easier by far. The driver's side easily takes double to triple to even quadruple the amount of time that the passenger side does. On the passenger side, you don't have to worry about the master cylinder, brake booster, steering column, steering box, washer fluid reservoir, wiring harness. I mean, the list goes on, but you know, it is doable. But with the exhaust now out of the way, we can move on to one of the larger jobs at hand, which is pulling the transmission. So the drive shafts on these older Mustangs are actually pretty darn simple. We just have two bolt holders holding in the U-joint side on the differential, and that'll free it up. And then on the tail shaft of the transmission, they simply use a slip yoke. There's no complicated split shaft or anything like that. So you can just basically slide it right on out of the transmission and spill absolutely no transmission fluid everywhere in the process. We then use a highly professional technique of about 20 rubber bands over a Ziploc bag, and that makes sure that absolutely zero transmission fluid spills out of the tail shaft. But with the tail end sorted out, I can move on to the smaller parts of pulling the transmission. But as you may notice, we are rocking a T5, which is a 5-speed manual transmission out of, I believe this one's out of a Fox body Mustang. And so I put this in about a year before doing the swap, mostly just because I find driving automatic to be pretty darn boring, especially when you're in a muscle car. I mean, I want to roll my own gears, man. But the car originally had a C4 3-speed auto, but yeah, it just wasn't cutting it. So looking further into the point of swapping a 351, fortunately the T5 bolts up right to it with no issue. That goes for the flywheel as well, at least for the older style. I believe it's a 28-ounce counterweight on the flywheels, and so that works on, I believe, every single 351. They changed it on the 302s, but they didn't change it on the 351. And so with that, since I'm using a clutch cable instead of a Z-bar or hydraulic setup, all I need to do is remove the inspection cover. And I'm also going to take note of the measurement for my cable adjustment, since I dialed that in pretty well with the 302. And so I just want to set it up the exact same way for the 351, so we're taking note there. There are a few small things to note while pulling these, the first being the two separator plate bolts at the bottom of the separator plate. It'll make your life pretty difficult if you do forget these two and you're trying to pull the transmission, but after we do pull those, we can use a jack. I use a transmission jack in this case, but pretty much any normal jack would work. That can actually hold the weight of your transmission. And we're just using it to apply some pressure underneath the transmission so that when we're pulling the bell housing bolts, they're a bit easier to get off. There are simply a few bolts on either side of the bell housing, and then there's two up top to depending on the car, the top two are a bit easier to get at from the engine bay, which in this case for my 73 Mustang was a bit easier. But after that, we have the tail housing cross member, which holds up the rear of the transmission, and we do need to remove that. It's just a few bolts on either side. And then do your best also not to forget the speedometer cable as well. If you forget that in there and you're trying to pull the transmission, especially if you're using some sort of lift and you don't even realize that it's underneath there, you could damage the cable and the transmission tail housing. A lot of stuff could go wrong there, but you would hope that you damage the cable rather than the transmission. But with that out of the way, you're pretty much good to go on dropping the transmission, which totally did not fight me the entire time and was super simple to just pull right out. I'm sort of kidding, it did take me about 10 minutes. You do got to fight with them sometimes, but once you get it out, it is pretty satisfying and creates a lot of room for the next steps that we need to take. At this point, we're actually pretty close to getting this motor out. We're mainly focused on getting everything out of the way that we think will cause issues while pulling the motor. So first up was the spark plug wires, just because they're pretty easy to get out of the way. They're right on top. I don't know that I would say they're mandatory, but I didn't want them catching on anything, so I decided to go ahead and pull them out anyway. Then we had things like the upper radiator hose and the water pump hoses. We're pulling the water pump hose since we're actually going to need part of the water pump later on, so easy to get this out of the way while we have access. One of the larger objects in the way is going to be the radiator and fan shroud actually. The fan can be a bit difficult to pull off since you got to stick your hands around in there. It's not a clutch fan, so it's easier in that regard where you don't need to fight the clutch, but you do need to get that out, and then with that you do have enough room to pull the shroud up and out of the way. After that, we want to start pulling some of the accessories that we now have room to pull, first being the alternator, which is pretty straightforward. Don't forget to pull the wiring harness connections off the back of the alternator first, but after that, since we have a V-belt set up, you can basically just loosen the two bolts holding the alternator bracket on, and then just pull the alternator off. After that, we want to look at the power steering pump, which is pretty similar to pulling the alternator, but we do need to keep in mind of the high pressure supply line going to the steering box, as well as the return hose for the power steering pump. The bracketry is pretty similar to the alternator, and it pops off pretty easy with the two bolts holding it on. I would recommend plugging up the return and high pressure lines on the power steering pump, as it will spill power steering fluid all over the place if you don't, but that pretty much sums up the power steering pump. I did decide to pull the crank. I wouldn't say it's mandatory, but I did so anyway. I did plan on having this motor sitting on the ground afterwards, so I wanted it out of the way just in case it did cause any issues there. I also pulled some of the brackets that held on some of the other accessories since they were pretty easy to access at this point in time. The lower radiator hose was next, and I would highly recommend having a bucket ready because this is where most of your water is going to pour out. But once you have that, we also have the mechanical fuel pump to deal with, which is going to spill a little bit of fuel, but not a ton. After that, we're pretty much just cleaning up the small things on the motor to get it ready for pulling. We have the ground wire on the block, stuff like the cable linkage to take off the manifold, and then we also have the coil in my case. That sort of matters on where you decide to place yours, but any vacuum lines and accessories going into the manifold that are connected to the body of the car need to be taken off. In my case, I had the brake booster line that I had to take off. But pretty much at this point, you're ready for the big moment of placing the carb engine hoist mount onto the intake and bringing the engine hoist over to finish the job. We can hook up to get a tiny bit of tension on the chain, but hold on because we still got the motor mounts. We're going to pull the two bolts holding the motor in place on the motor mounts, and these are horizontally placed, I guess you would say parallel with the motor actually. And it's mostly just a shear force on there, and so when you apply the tension there, they're mostly just resting, the engine is resting on the motor mount, so those bolts should just slide out pretty easy. But once you get that, you're pretty much good to go because the motor will still be sitting in place from resting on the motor mounts, and you can start pulling up. And you're basically just pulling up slowly, making sure you're not snagging on anything. And at that point, you can take a minute to look at your slow and underpowered 302, and then put a smile on your face knowing that you're about to make a lot more power with your 351. So that is going to wrap it up for the first video we got here. This is of a 3-part series. In the next video, we will be completely tearing down the 351 Windsor motor to the crank and the block, replacing some important components because we find some stuff that we don't really like to see in a motor, cleaning it up, painting it, and getting it ready to be transplanted back into the Mustang. So thank y'all for watching.